What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. Today is another True Crime Sunday, and if you watched my last video, which you will have to watch if you haven't watched, you will know that we are talking about Timothy Jones Jr. and this is the second part to, I think it's going to be a 3-part series, because we've already done one video and we've spoken about what had happened and we've spoken about the defense's portion of the trial. This video is going to be focused on the prosecution's portion of the trial, and also going to be talking about the moments that led up to the murders of the 5 Jones children, and also going to be talking about some of the child safety's involvement in the case. Then I think in the last video, because when I did the first video, the trial hadn't been sentenced yet. At this point in time, when I'm filming it right now, he has had his verdict read out. However, he hasn't had his sentence. So I'm going to be doing the verdict and the sentence in the 3rd video of this series. So in this video today, we're going to be talking about people in Tim Jones's life, the moments which led up to the children's murders, and child safety's involvement in the time before the murders, and also the prosecution's witnesses. So let's talk about Tim's grandmother. So Tim's grandmother actually took the stand. She was quite emotional, and something that I spoke about in the last video was that Tim's father and Tim's grandmother, while they are testifying on his behalf, they also have not a lot of reason to lie, because they also loved these children. They don't deny. So none of what we're talking about right now, and none of what we have ever spoken about in this case, is determining whether or not Tim actually murdered his children, because we know he did, because he's confessed to it. This entire trial is trying to figure out whether or not Tim was sane at the time of the murders, and whether or not Tim is now schizophrenic / has been schizophrenic and brain damaged for this whole time. Tim's grandmother took the stand, and she basically painted a picture of Tim and Tim's family's history with schizophrenia, because there's, I think, 20 people in his family who have pretty bad mental health issues and suicide endings of their life. So basically, Tim's grandmother is coming on the stand and basically painting a pretty good picture of what Tim's history is. And she talks a lot about Tim's mother. So Tim's mum's name is Cynthia. Now, the grandmother would describe Cynthia as we discussed in the first video, getting worse when she got pregnant with Tim in terms of the schizophrenia, because they didn't know she had schizophrenia, and it escalated to the point where she was cutting up her own clothes. And Tim's dad, as we know from his testimony, thought that Cynthia was just cutting up her clothes because she thought she was fat after the pregnancy, all this stuff. But they realized it got worse when Cynthia started to dress Tim in layers and layers and layers of clothes in the middle of summer. And she also would withhold food from Tim because she claimed she didn't want to have a fat baby. She would wash Tim in freezing cold water as a child. She would also let Tim cry when he had soiled himself, and she would get frustrated to the point where she would scream at her infant child who was crying after he'd soiled himself. She would scream, "Shut the F up," and all this kind of stuff. And she would sit in the corner and not speak for hours on end. So she, at this point, it was pretty obvious that she had problems, and that is the beginning of when they had her institutionalized. Now, we've already heard a lot of Cynthia's story through Tim's father's testimony, which I spoke about in the first video. So I'm not going to go into her kidnapping Tim, because hopefully you've watched the first one, so you know what's going on. From here, the grandmother on the stand is, like, they make it very clear that their family isn't your traditional family. So they have had domestic violence issues in their family, and they wanted, I guess the defense, because this was their witness, they wanted to make it clear, like, we know that their family isn't like a perfect family, so prosecution, don't come for our witness. So they were basically like, you've had problems with domestic violence, drugs. At one point there was a shooting in the family, and the grandmother was like, yes, 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 yes. They don't deny that they're not the perfect family. But they use this to kind of push the idea that this is why Tim is how he is today, because they were like to the grandma, so all of these issues were happening while Tim was there as a child witnessing all of this stuff going down. And she was like, yes. This is when they start talking more personally about Tim's brain injury, which, okay, let's just go into it. So basically she says that Tim got into a car accident when he was 15, and the doctors all said that he was fine. Now, she herself says that she didn't see any sort of change in Tim after this injury, which is presumed to be the injury that has given him this supposed brain damage that they've only just found after the murders. So this is, you know, how I spoke about in the first video, how he's got this like indent in his head, like it's pretty visible. Even though they did show the pictures of his brain, how it was like indented and there was blood still in his head, all these years later, it's pretty clear that he has this injury, especially now that he's lost all of his hair. So she's basically just telling us the circumstances in which that happened. So they're trying to prove that this is why his head looks like this, and they're trying to say that this is what made him do what he did today, just trying to do all that sneaky stuff. She does say that Tim always wanted to be something special. He didn't want to be average, and he was always trying to be different from everyone and just being pretty extra. Although his good boy attitude did kind of go away when he was growing up, he did get in trouble for doing drugs, and during the testimony they did say that it was crack cocaine, but later on, after the, like not after the trial but before deliberations, they did have to clear up that it was powder cocaine. So like, and this is so funny because I don't know drugs because my parents are drug addicts, like heroin addicts and things like that. So I just, anyone who does drugs and anything like that, I just pretty much separate myself from. I mean, I have done powder cocaine before one time, but I'm talking about like different cocaine. And I actually didn't know that there was like I didn't know what the difference was. So I actually had to Google it, and like crack cocaine, I think from my understanding of it, is like real cocaine. I don't even know if I'm making any sense right now. If you know drugs, then you know. If you don't know, then maybe Google it, because I don't think I'm going to do a very good job in explaining it. But basically, he wasn't doing the hectic cocaine. He got in trouble with the police with just like party cocaine, the rich people cocaine, you know what I'm saying? So he was convicted of that, as we already know from his father's testimony, that he did get put in jail for that. It wasn't so much of a like, you're in prison now because you had party cocaine. I think it was more of like a, for 1 year you have to be in this special boot camp, which is where we know he found his religious side. So I did just want to put out there that in the first video, that's what we had said. But at the time when I said that in my first video, only half of the trial had happened, and that's what I was reporting on. So later on, when I've watched the full trial, they did come out and say, hey, remember when we said that he did crack cocaine? It was actually just powder cocaine. So I thought that I would put that out there and correct myself, because they corrected their self. So it was just powder cocaine. This is when she starts testifying about what everyone else has already said. It hit this random religious thing that he came out of this boot camp with, this jail thing with. And she said that she felt like Tim had been pulled into a cult. She said she didn't know what had happened to him, and she said that they could not have a conversation without him bringing up the Bible, bringing up scripture, and all this kind of stuff. And she said at one point she tried to buy Mira some clothes that she thought were really cute, and she said that they were, the clothes that she had bought Mira were trousers. So she said that Tim said, hey grandma, go have a look at the store's bathrooms, come back to me and tell me what's on the girl's door. And so she was like, I don't know, there's like a stick figure. And Tim was like, okay, and what is the girl's stick figure wearing? And she's like, a dress? And he was like, exactly. And that's when he was like, girls wear dresses, boys wear trousers. Mira is not wearing trousers. She is only to wear dresses. Tim's grandmother was like, okay, Tim, calm down. She said at this point she had found out where Cynthia was because it had been years and years and years. Tim is now basically, well, he's an adult. He has children now. And she said she found out where Cynthia was. They hadn't seen Cynthia in a really long time. And she said that Tim wanted to meet Cynthia. And so everything was organized for Cynthia to come down. She was able to get out of the institution so that she could meet Tim. And she said that after meeting his mother, Tim wanted nothing to do with her. I've seen a picture of this. If I can post it here, I will post it here. But basically, when Cynthia got off the bus, she was wearing men's clothes. They said that she was wearing a rope around her waist to hold up her trousers, and she said that Tim wanted nothing to do with his mother. And she said that because they had brought Cynthia here and she had the weekend with them, that Cynthia had to stay at her house. And Tim's grandmother said that she slept with her door closed and locked because she was scared of Cynthia. So there are pictures of when Tim met Cynthia. They look kind of happy from what I remember. I don't know, but basically Tim's grandmother said that meeting his mother frightened him, and I can imagine it frightening him because the last time he saw her when he was younger, he said that she was swatting things away that weren't there, talking to people that weren't there. And I think, and I've had this experience myself as well. I always had really good, well, not really good at the time. I thought they were really good because I was young, and I you know, your mother is everything. I always remembered my mother looking beautiful, and I had this picture of my mother, and it was when she was younger, and she reminded me of an actress that I'd seen on the TV that I just always, whenever I saw this actress, I was like, that looks like my mum or whatever. And then I remember when I was older and I met my mother, it was a big shock. She had no teeth. She was huge, and she was like, she had like sores on her, and she was very bogan. And I remember that just like scaring me, and I remember it just being very uncomfortable. And I was just like, you're not my mum. You're not my mum. And she was just very frightening. So I can relate. At this point, when Tim's grandmother was on the stand, she started telling stories about the kids. And this is where I'm reminded that Tim's grandmother doesn't have a reason to be dishonest about her fond memories of Tim and the family, because as soon as she started talking about the children, in particular a garden that they had made in, like, it was like a little garden that they put stones around, and I guess it was just a very special moment. Oh, is my camera like not focusing? So Tim's grandmother was just telling the court a story about this little garden that the kids had made in her garden, and she started crying, and she started talking about, you know, that they showed the court pictures and stuff of the kids, and it really, it was quite sad. She started telling the court about a time shortly before the murders that Tim had brought the kids to see her and her husband, which is Tim's grandfather. Tim and his grandfather went to go and get the kids and everyone that was there some pizzas, and they left on foot, so they were walking. And shortly after, Tim returned without his grandfather, and his grandmother was like, what are you doing? And Tim was like, oh, I'm just gonna take the car to go and get his grandfather. And she noted that at this time, Tim was sweating profusively. And she said he seemed scattered, and she was like, okay. And so Tim took the car, and then after this, Tim's grandfather came back on foot with the pizzas, and Tim's grandmother was like, where's Tim? And Tim's grandfather was like, I could ask you the same question. He just left. And then shortly after this, that's when Tim returned back to the house. He didn't say anything about where he had been, and he was still sweating profusively. She asked if the kids who weren't in school at this time could stay with them, and this is when Tim said no, because he couldn't be away from his babies for that long. And this is when the live stream showed how Tim reacted when his grandmother said this on the stand, and he was crying. And we haven't seen Tim cry a lot during this live stream of the trial. The only time I saw him cry before this point was when Amber was telling the court who Tim used to be and why she originally fell in love with him, because he cried then as well. So Tim's grandmother would also tell the court a time when, and this was shortly before the murders, that Tim had let the kids stay at his grandparents' house while he was out. I think it was shortly before 3 a.m. when he returned. And when the kids stayed at their grandparents' house, the kids would sleep in the grandparents' bed with the grandparents. So when Tim came home around 3 a.m., he asked his grandparents, why was Mira behind the couch at 3 a.m. crying and screaming? And Tim's grandparents looked at each other and they were like, Mira was in the bed with us the whole time. Like, there was, at no point was she downstairs screaming and crying. They would have woken up. And they said that they think Tim had either dreamt this or it was all in his head. But they described this incident as being strange. They said that she was never behind the couch crying and she was in the bed with them the whole time. The defense then showed a video of Tim and his grandmother. So Tim was sitting in a chair here, his grandmother was sitting on the couch here, and the kids were like running around and playing, and I don't know who was filming this video. It seems a bit weird for, I don't know, maybe they just, I don't know, I don't have a family, I don't know what people film for memories or whatever, but the kids were playing and they were jumping all over Tim, and Tim had his leg out and the younger boys were like balancing themselves on his leg, and Mira was lying on his lap and laughing, and basically this was them showing that the kids loved Tim, Tim loved the kids, Tim would play with the kids, and it was a very sweet video to watch. The grandmother would testify that it was during this weekend that the video was taken that Tim was sweating profusively. And the defense then says, did you know that Tim was smoking synthetic marijuana at this time? And she was like, I had no idea. And then the defense will say that this sweating is withdrawals from coming off synthetic marijuana, which, can I just say, during this, I've never heard of synthetic marijuana in my life, but I've smoked marijuana before and I've never had withdrawal symptoms from it. And I know that I've never sweated to the point where I'm visibly wet. So my question is why is synthetic marijuana legal and normal marijuana? I just, honestly, I think it sounds like synthetic marijuana has a lot more like dangers to it than regular marijuana. I don't understand. I know that it's illegal in some places, but for it to be, I just, don't at me. I just don't understand drugs, okay? Anyway, moving on. So this is when the prosecution came up to cross-examine Tim's grandmother, and they asked her if she ever saw any sort of change after Tim had his car accident at 15. And she said she may have seen a change, but she would just chalk that down to Tim being a teenager and going through the same things that teenagers do, you know, when they like rebel against society. I feel like everyone has that like little phase, and for some that phase is bigger than others. But yeah, she said she didn't see a particular change, and if there was any sort of change, that would be chalked down to Tim just going through puberty and stuff like that. They then asked her if Tim ever spoke to himself, ever had hallucinations. She said no to both. They then asked her if Tim ever told her that he thought the kids were out to kill him or get him or hurt him in any way, and she said no. And then she said that they were extremely proud of Tim. And when he got his job at Intel, she said that she and Tim's grandfather would actually drive past the building and just feel this great sense of pride, and they were proud of Tim. She said that Tim, even though he grew up with Cynthia, well, not with Cynthia, he grew up having a schizophrenic mom, that he only witnessed that from up until 2 years old. So she said that he was incredibly spoiled as a kid, especially because he still had a dad who really cared about him, who spoiled him and maybe spoiled him too much. Now, let's talk about the first babysitter. Her name is Joy, and when she got on the stand, her voice was shaky, sis. Like, you can tell that she really cares for children. You can tell, and let me just say, I'm really sorry if my camera's not focusing. I don't know why it's not. Maybe because I've got contacts in. So Joy is this, she's just a beautiful, I know she's not a character, she's a real person, but she's just a beautiful character. And you can tell that she really cared about these kids because her voice was shaking the whole time that they spoke about her. And Joy will come in later on in the trial as well, but just in this first time that she's asked to the stand, she is just, I really feel for her. Now, Joy said that when she first started working for the Joneses family, she met the Jones through a mutual friend called Christina. And when she first started working for the Joneses family, she said that the trailer was full of dirty dishes, there was a whole bunch of clutter, and she said that it was just basically in a state of disarray, and she tried to help clean up whenever she was on duty, whenever she was on her shifts. She said that there was always trash around, and she even said that there were roaches in this trailer. She said at one point when she would go to this family vacation weekend thing with Tim, so she went to look after the kids, and just basically because Tim was a single dad, he had 5 kids, he still wanted to take the kids to places like Disney World and the beach, but he had 5 of them. And so he had asked Joy to come on this vacation to kind of assist in their holiday duties and, you know, basically make sure that everything went smoothly, because he still did want to go on vacation with his kids, but obviously there's a lot of them. And so she said yes, and she said that the first day they were there, they went to the beach where Tim would like videotape, I guess, to have like their family memories and stuff. And that's when the court saw this videotape. It was touching. He was playing with the kids, and the kids looked like they were having a lot of fun going in and out of the waves and things like that. So they, yeah, showed that video, and it pulled on your heartstrings a lot. And then Joy said that it was, I think, the next day that they went to Disney World, and they mentioned that I think it was Natan's favorite toy was this Woody toy, and he got to meet not the real Woody, but you know how at Disney World they like dress up as characters and stuff. Well, he actually got to meet this real life Woody, and they showed the court all of these pictures from that vacation and things like that, and the kids looked like they were having a lot of fun. Then Joy would say it was that night that they stayed in a hotel. They could only afford 1 room, but it was a big room. She said that Tim left to go to a bar, and she was looking after the children. She said that when she was alone with the children, I think the kids were like jumping on the bed or something, and she had asked them to stop, and they were still jumping on the bed. And this is when Tim came home. He had seen that the kids were still jumping on the bed. He had heard Joy say stop jumping on the bed, and so he came in and he was like, Joy just told you to stop jumping on the bed and you're still jumping on the bed. So we have to remember that Gabrielle was only 2 years old. This is still a baby. And obviously Natan was very small in build, and he obviously was a little boy as well, but obviously he wasn't 2, Gabrielle was 2, but they were both very young little boys. And it was at this point that Tim took his belt off, took the boys' pants down, and started beating them. Joy said that she was absolutely shocked at this point. The boys were screaming, begging him to stop, but he kept going. She said that they were beaten raw. She said she had begged Tim to stop, and eventually he did stop, but he said, these are my children, and she felt very uncomfortable at that point, because she said they were his children, but she just couldn't stand there and not say anything, because she said this was a very vicious beating on Tim's behalf. Joy said the only reason she stopped working for Tim was because she couldn't make it to work anymore, because she would go to work to Tim's trailer by driving her parents' car and something happened with her transport to where she couldn't get to work anymore, and that is the only reason that she stopped working for Tim. She said that there was a little bit of bad blood when she quit, because Tim had said that he paid her in advance and she owed him work. And she said, you never paid me in advance. And then he threatened legal action on her through her friend Christina, who had told her about Tim in the first place. And she said that she told Christina to tell Tim, you do what you have to do, threaten legal action if you want, but you didn't pay me in advance and I don't owe you anything. Joy said that she begged her friend Christina, because Christina still had contact with the kids, she still had access to the children, and Tim would sometimes leave the kids with Christina. So Joy said that she begged Christina to feed the kids whenever she saw them. And this is because whenever Joy was working there, the kids would beg for food. She said that when she would come back on the weekdays after not being there on the weekend, because she didn't work weekends, that she would always feed the kids because she knew the kids did not get food when she wasn't there. Joy said that it was an unspoken rule between the children and her that she wouldn't tell Tim that she fed the children. She said at many points the children would beg Joy not to tell Tim that they had been fed, otherwise Tim wouldn't feed them for a really long time. And she said she would never tell Tim. And you know, Joy is not a rich lady. She said she could only feed them oatmeal, but they loved helping her make oatmeal, and she would feed them as much as she could with what she had on a regular basis. And she said it was like this unspoken bond that she had with the children. And this would happen on several occasions, not just with food. But she did say at one point when she had come back from the weekend and she tried to feed the kids, one of the children, Gabriel, wouldn't eat, and she was like, what's wrong? Well, she was like, what's wrong, baby? Because, you know, Joy is just this beautiful character. She's not a character, I say that as in like her soul character, but Joy's this beautiful character, and she's like, what's wrong, baby? And Gabriel, well, at least the other kids said that Gabriel wasn't allowed to eat anything because he had a bowl in the fridge of this, like, Joy said it was like this disgusting goop that the kids said Gabriel had to eat, otherwise he wouldn't get fed. And the kids said that Tim said Gabriel was not to have any other meal. He refused to give Gabriel any other meal until this bowl was eaten. It was at this point that Joy was like, oh, hell no, sis. And she basically just threw the goop in the bin and made Gabriel eat. She said that the kids told her that Gabriel was banned from the table, that the kids were allowed to eat at the table, and then once the kids finished, Gabriel was then allowed to go to the table and eat his meal. So he was kind of being, what is the word, kind of being pushed out and secluded from the rest of the kids as kind of a punishment as well. There was another time when she said that the kids showed her a photo album, and Joy said that for any family she's ever worked for, she loves to know everyone in the family. She's just that kind of babysitter. She wants to be involved and stuff like that. And so when the kids brought out the photo album, she was really excited and she wanted to see what was in it. And so the kids showed her, and there were lots of pictures of Amber, and she said that the kids were like, I really wish that you could meet our mum. And she was like, I wish that I could too. And then the kids suspected that Tim was coming home at this point, to which they quickly closed the photo album, they hid the photo album, and they turned to Joy and they said, please don't tell Daddy that we showed you Mum. And so there was another unspoken rule where she would keep these kids' secrets. And it's not like these secrets are like they were doing something naughty. They were doing the most innocent, beautiful things, and those innocent things have consequences in their family, and they were petrified that their dad would find out that they looked at a photo album with their mother, because Amber was a huge trigger for Tim. Like, he would not have it. She said that Elaine loved to help her prepare oatmeal, that Elaine, like, while all the other kids would do their, I guess, their study when she first got there, that it was Elaine who loved to help in the kitchen. She said that the only time they ever saw the kids eat from food provided from their father was when he bought them a 20-piece McDonald's like chicken McNugget pack, like nuggets that came in a 20-piece, and the kids had to share that 20-piece amongst each other. So there's 5 kids and there's 20 nuggets that they had to share between them, and that was the only time they ever ate food provided from their father. And we know at this point that Amber, even though she's not the one who had the job and Tim had the job, Amber was the one who was providing money and checks for Tim, for the children, to get food, to get nappies, all the stuff that the kids needed. Joy then described Tim's unusual way of punishing the children. He would make them stand on their tippy toes for hours. And then obviously we know the usual stuff of like him making them do push-ups, squats, burpees, PTing them basically. She said at one point when she was there, Tim made the kids bring in this huge log that like Tim wanted her to see, because their punishment was having to hold this like really heavy piece of wood or some crap like that, where they had to do squats with it and hold it for long periods of time. And she said that she was just like confused about why Tim wanted her to see this, but the kids showed it to her, and she didn't make the kids know that she was like, what the heck? She was like, oh yeah, cool. But inside she was like, she said at one point Tim tried to take the kids out of school, and that he tried to ask her to homeschool the kids. And this was when I think it was the defense who said, did you end up homeschooling the kids? And Joy said, I'm a babysitter. I can't teach the kids. I don't know how to teach the kids. And so I said no. Joy said that after she had quit, she really wanted to call child safety and make a report, because she knew in her gut that it wasn't right. And she said she was with a friend and she was telling a friend like, I really want to report this, but I can't, I'm really, really scared. And her friend said, no, you have to report this, we're gonna do it right now. And she said it was her friend that called child safety, and her friend stayed with her while she made her report to child safety. And part of this report was about Tim beating the children. And Joy, at this time of making this report, didn't actually know that child safety were well aware of Tim abusing, physically being not great to his children, and that he'd already had like an order placed upon him by child safety to say he wasn't allowed to lay hands on the children. So Joy didn't know any of this when she made her report. So her making her report prompted child safety to like make another investigation into Tim. So let's now learn about child safety's involvement with this family. This is when the prosecution brings out a DSS worker, and for my sake, I'm just gonna call, because I don't know the American version of this, I just know because I'm a foster child and I've got my own terminology in terms of Australian child safety. I'm just gonna call the worker a child safety officer, and I'm just gonna call the company, or like not the company, you guys know what I'm saying, I'm just gonna call them child safety, because that's what we call them here, and I might get the terminology mixed up, so I'm just gonna use what we use in Australia, which is child safety and child safety officer. So this child safety officer came up into the stand and said that Tim was actually investigated 3 times before the murders of the children. Now, the child safety officer said that the first time Tim was investigated was when Natan's teacher actually called child safety, because teachers have a duty of care. If they see any marks or anything like that, or if they hear the child say that there has been abuse occurring, that's when they have a duty of care to call child safety. So child safety were contacted by the teacher, and they came straight away. So in America, they have a system where it is like a point system. So it dictates the amount of time, or at least the urgency of the case. And this particular case was a .02 case, which means that the child safety officer needs to be at the scene within 2 hours. So this was a very urgent case. There are other cases where it's like a period of they have to be there within 24 hours, but this was you need to be here within 2 hours. So the child safety officer came and they saw these marks around Natan's neck. So Natan's teacher said that Natan claimed that Tim had choked him. And on the stand, the DSS worker, and look, I don't know if she's telling the truth about this. I don't believe she would be, if the children were still alive, and look, I don't know what her motivations are. She says that she doesn't remember the teacher saying that Natan said he was choked. She interviewed Tim after she saw Natan's neck. And so directly after she saw Natan, she has a duty to call the parent and say, hey, letting you know we've received a report and we need to investigate this. Can you please come down to our office and have an interview? So Tim was like, okay. And so he went down to their office and she said that she had two officers, so two police officers there just in case anything got out of hand. She said she interviewed Tim and Tim said that I didn't choke him, I merely lifted Natan up by his collar, which must have caused bruises around his neck. Now the teacher says that Natan said that Tim had choked him, whereas Tim says, and the DSS officer / investigator said that Tim pulled him up by the collar. So which one of these you want to believe is up to you. I personally think because the children were strangled and that's how they died, I tend to lean towards the fact that Natan said that Tim choked him, and that's why my mind goes to this incident was maybe a precursor for what would later happen to the children. That's just where my mind goes. That's just a theory that I have. But on the stand, the DSS worker claims that she doesn't remember that. She claims that it was under her understanding that Natan was pulled up by his collar. Either way, that's pretty fucked up, if you ask me. Tim said the reason that he pulled Natan up by his collar was because Tim, at the time, was building a train set with another one of the boys, and Natan got jealous and destroyed the train set, and that's why Tim claims that he lifted him up by the collar and that he didn't realize how, honestly, either way, I wouldn't pick up a child by their collar. If you had to lift up a child because they were throwing a tantrum, you would scoop them up under the arms or just pick them up by the belly. I can't imagine lifting a full child up by their collar. To me, that's abuse. The DSS worker, child safety officer, said that after this interview with Tim, she found that the kids were fine to stay with Tim. She didn't see any reason to take the kids off Tim. And she said that she did follow Tim back home because she wanted to make sure that the living arrangement was okay. And she said that the reason she followed Tim from the office was to make sure that he didn't have time to clean up anything or whatever. She did say that when she saw the trailer, there was an excessive amount of religious items in the house, and that's what she made notes about at the time, because when she's on the stand, the prosecution and the defense are looking at her notes and asking her questions about the notes that she wrote. And the religious items was one of the things that they had noted, or at least that she had noted and they were asking about. She did say that she went back the next day to make sure that Natan hadn't gotten any repercussions from her original visit. She said that he was a little withdrawn and didn't share a lot with her, but she didn't think that was a big deal, and she didn't see that as like he was now scared to talk to her. She might be, look, I'm not judging, maybe, I don't know. I feel like I have a lot of judgment because I have hindsight and I know that these children have now been murdered, and I also have my own experience with child safety officers ignoring the neglect that I faced and the abuse that I faced, and so maybe I'm just judging a little bit, but to me that's a red flag. But obviously to her it wasn't at the time. Hindsight is beautiful. She said there was another time that she went to the house unannounced, and it must have been one of the children's birthdays, she said, because Tim had gotten them cupcakes and they were enjoying like a little birthday thing, and she said to her that seemed fine. She said that this case was closed and the conclusion to the case was that there was substantial risk of physical abuse. However, the DSS weren't going to intervene, and I don't understand that finding. I honestly don't, but she said that this was a decision that the DSS team had come to, and so the case was closed from there, and they didn't investigate any further until. So remember our favorite babysitter, Joy? Well, remember when she made her call to child safety? Well, the next investigation is because she made that call to child safety. So the same child safety officer opened another case, and she said that she drove down to the trailer with 2 deputy sheriffs. She said that one sheriff stayed with Tim while she read out the report, and then another deputy sheriff came with her into the trailer to take pictures of the boys to see if there are any marks on them, which there were none. And the report said that Tim only fed the children chicken nuggets. And she then said that she went to Tim's neighbor's house, who was their babysitter at the time, and this babysitter said that Tim was amazing and all this stuff, and we'll figure out why she says that later. But she said, no, Tim is amazing, like he's a really good father. And one of the children had like a patch on their eye, and it was like visibly bruised and stuff like that. And the babysitter said this was because the child had run into a doorknob, and Tim confirmed this. So it was the babysitter and Tim who confirmed that this child got this bruise because he ran into a doorknob, and the officer believed them. I don't know what the story is behind that. They could have run into a doorknob. Who knows? I don't know. But they say it was fine. She said at one point Tim like turned around and mumbled that it was probably Joy who made that call. So he knew that Joy made the call. Because the kids were murdered, the case would never be closed, and it can't be investigated, obviously. So that's when I say hindsight is a beautiful thing. I do think that the original complaint should have been, you know, I will say though, there was actually a time when another case was open because there were all of these like tools around. I think he was doing some work on the trailer, and the case was closed because they said, like the notes in that case said that he needed to make the house more safe for the kids and replace, because it was buying like some cheap nappies for the kids had like diaper rash, and so the findings from that one were just like buy better nappies and remove the hazards from the house. So yeah, so now we know that there were lots and lots of reports of abuse and also just bad and disgusting living arrangements, and then also the neglect in terms of food, which we know that the last case was never investigated because at this point the children have been murdered. So I know that there are some good and competent child safety officers, but the system is broken, and that's not just in America, it is particularly in Australia, and I am a product of that. I think that they are absolutely useless. And they, you know, my experience in foster care did a substantial amount of damage, and I have more damage from that than I did of my childhood before my foster care time. So that made me incredibly uncomfortable and angry to watch this portion of the trial because I resonate with it so much. Let's talk about the next babysitter. The next babysitter started working for Tim just after she turned 17 years old. Her name was Christina, and she would later get into a relationship with Tim. Well, not later, she would get into a relationship with Tim. So Tim is a fully grown man with 5 children, and she only just turned 17. The trial doesn't focus on the fact that this was like an underage-ish girl and they were dating. I'm just gonna point out that that's weird and gross and weird and gross. She said there was a point where Tim would actually get really strict with her. She said that at some point, he said she wasn't allowed to wear trousers. She had to wear dresses. She had to wear her dresses at a certain length, and he just became very controlling about how she spoke, how she dressed, and also how she looked after the children. Now, Crystal said that Tim would buy her dresses to wear, and this was also part of his control over her. Remember, she's only 17 years old, so it's pretty easy as a grown man to control a 17-year-old, especially if they are like, you know, not the most confident or aggressive 17-year-olds. And I also want to note that at this time, she also had her own baby. She says that Tim was very physical with his children, and she said at one point she heard him beating the children in the bathroom. She said that the beatings got so bad that you could see marks directly after he had finished beating them. And so after obviously it caused conflict, he did stop. But she did mention that one time Natan was playing with Mira and he accidentally fell through a window, and then he had to spend 24 hours standing on his tippy toes in the corner as a punishment for just doing like a childish thing, because they are children. She said at one point Mira caught head lice from someone at school, and Tim was furious to the point where he was beating Mira because he wanted Mira to tell him which child she caught head lice from, which child from school she used their brush, like. And he was beating her and she kept saying, I don't know. And he kept beating her, being like, which kid from school did you get head lice from? And Christina said that you could see the marks after she walked out of the room, and yeah, it was really bad. Now, Crystal actually says that she told the police about the abuse from the start. Christina said that she stopped working for Tim and she broke up with Tim when she saw, so she had just come home and Tim was with her baby, and she said that her baby accidentally knocked over a glass of water. And she said that while Tim didn't actually get the chance to because she stopped him, she said that she saw Tim going to beat her baby, and she was like, it was an actual baby. Obviously the baby did not mean to knock over the glass, and he was about to beat my baby. And so she said he never got the chance to because she took her baby and she was like, this is done. But she said that he was about to beat her child. Not just her child, this is a baby, an infant child, like a little baby. Now the next witness to come up, I'm sure you can tell with the look on my face, she's my favorite. My goodness. The next witness to jump on the stand, her name is Kimberly Cruz, and she's a neuropsychologist, and she was hired by the state, and she did a lot of tests on Tim. And the tests that she did on Tim were to figure out whether or not he was malingering. Now, the word malingering is going to be used a lot, so let me just explain what malingering is. Malingering is when you over-exaggerate or make up symptoms to a mental health disorder. Sis, it's gonna get juicy. So Kimberly Cruz said that the difference between her tests and Tim's team's witnesses that went on the stand, like, were psychologists and neuropsychologists who were being paid by Tim's defense team. So she said the difference between her tests and Tim's team's tests were that Tim's team's tests were based on information that Tim gave to the doctors, whereas her tests were looking at the answers that Tim gave a computer, which then spat out like scores that he would get. And she then, as a doctor, looked at whether or not he was over reporting symptoms or under reporting symptoms. And she said that her tests went for, like, I think it was 8 hours. Like, they did take breaks and everything so that the tests were accurate. And she also said that when Tim's team did their tests, Tim was on a really... Lolly! Okay, don't mind the sound in the background. I'm gonna try and be as loud as I possibly can, but I've just got a housemate moving out, so it might be a little bit loud. But basically, she said that when Tim's team did the tests, Tim was on a really high dosage of schizophrenic medication, which would impact the tests, because if you aren't schizophrenic and you are on schizophrenic medication, it is going to impact it, whether you want it to or not. So she said that she requires all of her patients to be off medication before she does the tests. So she said that was the difference between his team doing the test and her doing the test, as being as objective as she can. She also said that Tim's team is not going to be objective. And she said the only reason she was brought onto this case was because the original test that they had done didn't really make a lot of sense to the doctor who did the test. So she was brought on then to make sense of the results that didn't make sense. She said that before she did the main tests on figuring out whether he was malingering and whether or not he did actually have any signs of psychosis, were cognitive tests to see if he actually had the cognitive ability to move on to do more tests. So she tested to see whether or not he was capable of doing the test, which she said that he scored pretty high on the cognitive test. So she said that he was able to then go on and do the rest of the tests. I said tests a lot in that thing, I'm sorry. She said the reason they did so many tests is because, unlike the ones that his team did, she said you can't do 2 or 3 and make assumptions from that. She said that you need to do tests on a whole bunch of different things and then collate all of the information before it can make any sense, especially when you're trying to say that someone has schizophrenia or a really complicated disorder. And so she said that that's why they did so many throughout the day. She was also asked, before she went on to describe the rest of the ones that she did on him, she was asked to talk about whether or not his brain injury made a difference. And she said that she was aware that the doctor came up and showed 3D scans of his head, but she also said that in her field, she knows that the brain is adaptive, and that even though he does have this major dent in his head, she said that the brain has the ability to rejuvenate, and she said that he doesn't qualify for brain-induced psychosis or brain-induced anything. She said that it doesn't, in Tim's case, that does not apply to him. So that's interesting, and also throws out the defense's witness, their big doctor, that made a whole bunch of sense and that I was like really interested in. So I was like, oh girl. So she's saying that Tim does not qualify for a neurocognitive disorder. So she said that moving on to the next form of test, some of the tests were on whether or not he had psychosis or would fall under someone who has schizophrenia, and then other tests were validity tests, so to see whether or not Tim is being a reliable historian on his own symptoms, whether or not he is over exaggerating symptoms, whether he's over reporting symptoms, or whether he's under reporting symptoms. Because sometimes someone might want to under report symptoms so that they can come out of the test being like, you are perfectly fine. But she said that you can't do this with these tests because they are designed to figure out whether you are under reporting symptoms or over reporting symptoms. And she said that in all of these tests, it found that Tim was over reporting symptoms which he thought would mimic the symptoms of schizophrenia. Some of the tests that she gave were a SIMS test, a SIRS test, and an MFAST test. So the one that I just explained was the SIMS test. I had to write these down because this is pretty like bulky stuff. So the one that I just described to you was the SIMS test. The SIRS test is a breakdown of different areas of psychosis. Can you focus on? Jeez. And also in this particular test, the SIRS test, Tim reported rare symptoms, symptom combinations, and improbable and absurd symptoms, and he tested high in all those 3. So this test definitely showed that he was malingering. So this particular test, as I said, showed that he reported symptom combinations, rare symptom, improbable and absurd symptoms that someone with schizophrenia wouldn't have, but he believes that someone with schizophrenia would have, and that's why he overreported in those symptoms. The next test was the MFAST test. So the MFAST test showed that Tim reported unusual sensory symptoms. So Tim reported beyond the normal symptoms that a person with schizophrenia would usually report. So she said in every instance where she tested for psychosis, she found that Tim was malingering, over-exaggerating symptoms, which he thought connected to schizophrenia, but she also wanted to test if he had like any other form of mental health, because he definitely does not have any form of psychosis, no schizophrenia, no mania, anything like that. But it's pretty clear with all the evidence that we have that Tim does have some sort of mental health disorder. Definitely not one that induces psychosis, but she did want to test to see if he had anything else. And she says that the next tests that she did were basically true or false answers from Tim. So it's less looking at malingering, less looking at all that kind of stuff, because she's already determined that he is malingering because he's trying to say that he has schizophrenia when he doesn't. So this next set of tests she kind of just did to see if like what actually is going on here, and she found that he related more towards borderline personality disorder, which if you've followed my Instagram, if you've seen any of my videos, you know that that's what I have. And I can attest to the fact that you don't have any like, you can't, okay, so I've only experienced this once, but I don't know if this relates to borderline personality disorder. But in regard to Tim, he doesn't have any breaks of reality, anything like that, but borderline personality disorder is heavily trigger based. So you get triggered when you feel like you're being abandoned, you have hectic mood swings, and a lot of the symptoms are trauma based. So you have behaviors that are triggered by past trauma, which usually relate to things of being like abandoned, neglected, things like that. The prosecution then said, does this kind of sound like the thing I Hate You, Don't Leave Me? And then she was like, that's a book that was written by a psychiatrist. But yeah, that is a very good way of kind of describing what borderline personality disorder is kind of like a creating situations in your life that might kind of break up a relationship to be like, kind of like, I hate you, but then that making up period is giving that person that sense of validation as being like, oh, so you're not leaving me, and then you actually do like me. So it's a very complex thing, and I might do a video on that later and explain what it basically is. But basically she's just saying that Tim leads more towards having borderline personality disorder, which is a significant mental health disorder, but it isn't schizophrenia, and that he's lying and over-reporting symptoms and malingering when it comes to schizophrenia, trying to say that he had a break in reality and that's why he killed all of his kids. And so yeah, the prosecution then asked her whether or not psychosis could have come about from drugs, and that's when she said no. The only way that psychosis could have been induced by drugs is if it was injected, and Tim never says that he's used anything like that in terms of drugs. Tim is trying to say that he had psychosis because of withdrawals or because he was taking synthetic marijuana at the time. And she's saying you don't, like, you can get that from synthetic marijuana, but it's very unlikely that this happened from having synthetic marijuana. And so she says psychosis likely would have only happened if he was like injecting drug, which he wasn't. So the next part was when the defense tried to cross-examine her, and it went on for like an hour, and it was basically an hour of them being like, so you're saying that you got your tests from a computer. How can a computer do this? And she's like, oh my God, you fucking losers. I didn't get my test results from a computer. My computer collated Tim's own responses, and then I, as a doctor, analyzed those. And yeah, I'm not even going to talk about the defense's cross-examining of her because it was just so annoying, and they really did not understand how she tested, and I feel like they were just kind of trying to be really annoying, and I could see her getting frustrated with their questions because she was like, what do you even mean, hun? So I'm just not even going to talk about that because it's just annoying. So basically, I'm sorry, there's going to be another video. The next video is going to be on the verdict of this case. So what the jury found him to be, so they had the options. So they had the options of whether he was going to be guilty, whether he was going to be guilty but has a mental illness, or whether he was going to be not guilty by reason of insanity or not guilty. So they had 4 options. I know what happened because it only happened yesterday, but the next video is going to be on that verdict, and then it's going to be in the next portion of the trial, which is going to be sentencing. So whether or not they're going to sentence him to die, because this is a death penalty case. They haven't decided whether or not he's going to die yet. I've only seen the verdict. I have not seen the sentencing version of this trial. I actually had no idea that there was a different section of a trial where they figure out sentencing. Like, I thought that the judge just like went away, the jury went away, and they were like figuring out whether or not they're going to sentence him to die or not, because that's how it is in movies. But apparently there's like a whole separate trial, so the prosecution and the defense bring forward extra evidence to say whether or not he should live or die. And so it's like a whole separate trial, which hasn't happened yet. So the next video that I put out, which will be next week's True Crime Sunday, will be on the verdict, and it will be on the evidence, and it'll be on whether or not Tim dies or not, which I don't know whether he will or not. So let me know in the comments below, do you believe in capital punishment? Do you believe that it should still be legal to kill people by the state? Or do you think that murderers should be locked up forever? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. It really does help. And if you want to subscribe and be a nice guy, I'll put my head here. I put out new videos twice a week. Every Sunday is a True Crime Sunday. Every Wednesday is a whatever I decide the heck is going to be. So if you want to subscribe, click my little head here, and I will see you in the next one.